The King, the Princess, and the Tinker by Kindt, McKenzie, illustrated by William Lowe. Chapter 5. Jack the Tinker. Now it happened that the very minute the wheels of the royal coach began to turn, Jack the Tinker, the pleasant fellow who lived in the pleasant village not too distant from the castle, also began a journey. He started not in a royal coach, but on his own 2 feet. And it came about this way. As the days and the years had passed, Jack lived happily with his wife and mended pots and pans, for that is what a tinker does. He and his wife had 7 children. They all lived in a small house with but 1 window and 1 door. If they were crowded, they did not notice, for they all loved one another and did not mind being close together. Tripping over one another only made them laugh. Every day of those many years, Jack watched as his children grew. He watched his wife as his wife sat beside him with a baby cradled in her arms. He watched as the babies grew to toddlers and tumbled about his feet. He watched as they grew big enough to weed the radishes and then old enough to tend the cow. He watched all of them, from the oldest to the youngest, while he sat on a bench outside the door and mended pots and pans. When Jack had mended a pot, he polished it until it gleamed in the sun. Then he squinted at the bright bottom and laughed at his wiggly reflection. He would call the children to come look at it, and they would laugh at their own wiggly reflections. Sometimes one of the children would put the pot on his head and cry, "Look at my crown, I am the king." "Then we must not look at you," Jack would say, and all the rest would turn their backs and refuse to look at the one with the crown. One day their mother said, "Oh, Jack, I hope none of us ever sees the real crown, for the king himself would no doubt be under it, and we could not help but see him. You know what that would mean. If we see a man with a shining pot on his head, we shall be careful to look the other way," Jack said with a twinkle in his eye. Sounds like a dad joke to me. "Oh, Jack, the king would not wear a pot on his head," his wife would say. Jack shrugged. "Ha! How do you know what the king's crown looks like? Though I suppose it must shine, it might as well be a kettle with the bail of it caught under his chin to keep it from falling off." The thought was so silly that he laughed all the more, and his children laughed too. Then Jack would be back at work. A king's crown was of no matter to him. He had pots to polish. When he grew tired of looking at the shining pots, he rested his eyes on his children's faces, or the village street, or the sparkling river, or the blue sky, and the green hills that rose around the pleasant valley. "How lovely the hills are," he said one day. "I wonder what lies beyond them." He kept wondering until one day he said, "Wife, I have been tinkering for years and have never gone beyond the village. I'm sure there's more to the world than the inside of a pan, and I do long to see it." "Husband," she said, "I cannot think of anything I would rather have you do than that which makes you happy. The cow is giving sweet milk, and the radishes are fat and red, and there is enough cheese and flour for bread to last at least 4 weeks and 4 days. Take a month and a day to go out and see the world, and then come back and tell us all about it." "I shall do more than that. I shall find something lovely to bring to you, and I shall be back in 30 days. The tinker cried joyfully. So it was that, while King John settled his second-best crown upon his head, he would not risk taking his most elegant crown from the castle, and wrapped himself in an ordinary cloak. He feared to take the one of velvet and silver on the road. Jack the Tinker rolled a second shirt and a second pair of socks into a kerchief and knotted it to a stick, which he rested on his shoulder. With a sour squint at the bent heads around him, King John entered his coach. Tinker Jack kissed his wife and children goodbye, and then kissed them all around once more. As King John felt the royal coach shudder and heard the wheels begin to creak, Jack wiped away a tear and clapped his hat on his head and set foot on the road. And Princess Sweet Rosilla, she held on tightly and kept her eyes wide open. That's the end of chapter 5.